Greenwich, Connecticut, December 25th. The wind screams against the siding, trying to force its way in, but the air inside the dining room is already freezing. My name is Tiffany Patterson. I am watching my brother toast to a $10 million empire that dissolved 5 minutes ago. He thinks he is a king because he signed a contract he did not read. He does not realize the silent partner he fears is sitting right across from him, holding a phone that has just become a gavel. Tonight, I am not a sister. I am a market correction. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Now, let's get into the story. The snow was not falling. It was driving. It came in horizontal sheets, gray and hard, slamming against the windshield of the Subaru like handfuls of gravel. The wipers slapped back and forth in a frantic, rhythmic struggle that did little to clear the glass. I did not slow down. I knew the road. I knew every frost heave and pothole on the winding route to Greenwich, because I had driven it every Christmas for 10 years, and before that, I had been driven on it in the back of luxury sedans that smelled of leather and my father's cigars. The Subaru was 5 years old. It had a patch of rust starting on the rear left wheel well, and the heater rattled when the fan was on high, but the engine block was sound and the tires were new. It was a machine that worked. It did not pretend to be anything else. I turned onto the long private drive of the Patterson estate. The gravel crunched under the snow tires, a thick, satisfying sound of friction and grip. The house rose up out of the white storm, a sprawling colonial revival, with black shutters and illuminated windows that looked like squares of butter melting in the dark. It was a beautiful house. It was the kind of house that appeared on holiday cards sent by people who wanted you to know they had succeeded. To the untrained eye, it was a fortress of old money and stability. But I was not an untrained eye. I was a forensic accountant. I looked at the house and I saw the cracks in the foundation hidden by the boxwood hedges. I saw the slate roof that hadn't been replaced in 30 years because the liquidity wasn't there. I saw a liability masquerading as an asset. I parked the car away from the front entrance near the garage, leaving the circular driveway clear. That was the unwritten rule. The front was for guests or for Caleb. The side was for service and for Tiffany. I checked my phone before I got out. The market had closed early for the holiday, but the crypto exchanges were running. I refreshed the portfolio. The number on the screen was long, precise, and quiet. It was 8 figures. It was liquid. It was mine. I locked the screen, shoved the phone deep into my coat pocket, and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold hit me instantly, a physical slap that stung the cheeks and watered the eyes. I liked it. It felt honest. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother Eleanor stood in the frame. She was wearing a green velvet dress that draped effectively over her shape, accented with gold jewelry that caught the foyer light. She did not step out to hug me. She shivered theatrically and ushered me inside with a flick of her hand. "Close it, Tiffany, quickly. You're letting the heat out," she said. Her voice was thin like wire. I stepped into the foyer. The heat was overwhelming. It smelled of pine needles, roasting meat, and expensive perfume, a suffocating perfumed warmth that stuck to the skin. "You're late," Eleanor said, looking at her watch. It was a Cartier tank, small and understated. "And look at your hair, it's flat. Did you not have time to blow it out?" "The roads were bad, Mother," I said. I hung my coat on the rack. It was a generic wool blend from a department store rack. She eyed it with a familiar, weary disappointment. "We were worried you wouldn't make it in that car," she said, choosing the word carefully. "But I suppose it's sensible, given your situation." "It gets me here," I said. My father, Robert, was in the study just off the foyer. He was sitting in his leather wingback chair, the one that faced the fireplace. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He did not turn around when I entered the room. "Is that her?" he asked the fire. "Yes, Robert. Tiffany has arrived," Eleanor said, smoothing her dress. "Tell her there's wine on the sidebar. Caleb isn't here yet. We're waiting for the boy." "Hello, Dad," I said. He grunted, taking a sip of the scotch. "Merry Christmas, Tiffany." I went to the sidebar. The wine was a Cabernet from Napa, a heavy tannic vintage that retailed for $80 a bottle. I poured a small glass. I watched my parents in the reflection of the mirror above the bar. They looked smaller than I remembered. They were shrinking into their furniture, surrounded by objects they insisted defined their worth. They treated me with a gentle, pitying distance the way one treats a rescue dog that isn't quite housebroken. They believed I was barely making rent. They believed I spent my days reconciling receipts for a mid-tier logistics firm in Stamford, living check to check, drowning in student loans they had refused to help with because it would build character. They were right about the character. They were wrong about the loans. I had paid them off 4 years ago. My simple accounting job was a front for my own consultancy, specialized in tracing hidden assets for divorce litigation and corporate fraud. I found money people tried to hide. And when I wasn't doing that, I was investing with an aggression that would have given my father a heart attack. The front door banged open, bringing a gust of wind and snow into the hall. The energy in the house shifted instantly. The silence broke. "The conquering hero returns," a voice boomed. Caleb strode into the room. He was 32 years older than me, and he vibrated with a manic, high-frequency energy. He wore a bespoke navy suit, cut slim to flatter his gym-honed build. His shoes were Italian leather already wet with snow, leaving puddles on the hardwood that Eleanor would never have tolerated from me. "Caleb," Eleanor's voice changed. It became musical. She rushed to him, kissing his cheek. "Look at you. You look exhausted, darling. Are you working too hard?" "Never too hard, Mom. Just hard enough." Caleb laughed. He walked past her and went straight to the father. He clapped a hand on Robert's shoulder. Robert stood up, actually stood up and shook his hand firmly. "Good to see you, son. Drink." "The best you have, Bob. We're celebrating tonight." Caleb turned and saw me. His smile didn't fade, but it changed temperature. It went from genuine to patronizing. "Tiff didn't see you there in the corner. You blend in." "Hi, Caleb." He walked over and squeezed my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a coach encouraging a bench warmer than a brother greeting a sister. "How's the number crunching, still counting beans for peanuts?" "It pays the bills," I said, taking a sip of wine. I looked at his wrist. A Breitling Navitimer. $7,000 easy. I looked at his eyes. They were wide, the pupils slightly dilated. Adrenaline. He was high on leverage. I knew for a fact Caleb had maxed out 3 credit cards last month because I had seen the data breach report from the credit bureau that included his name. He was floating on debt, wearing a suit he couldn't afford, drinking scotch he didn't buy. "Pays the bills," Caleb chuckled, turning back to the room. "That's the dream, right? Survival. But some of us have to aim a little higher than survival." "Caleb has big news," Eleanor announced, beaming. "But not yet, not until dinner." "Right," Robert said. He looked at me. The warmth left his face. "Tiffany, go help Maria in the kitchen. She's behind on the sides. Caleb and I need to discuss some strategy before we eat." "Of course," I said. "Make yourself useful," Caleb called out as he settled into the chair opposite our father, swirling his glass. "We're going to need the fuel. Big night." I placed my wine glass on the coaster. I did not finish it. I turned my back on the fire, on the leather chairs, on the warm circle of the real family. I walked through the swinging door into the kitchen. It was bright, sterile, and smelled of roasted rosemary. Maria, the housekeeper, who had raised us more than Eleanor ever had, looked up from the stove. She looked tired. "They sent you in?" she asked quietly. "They sent me in," I said. I picked up a peeler and a bag of potatoes. The water in the sink was cold. I put my hands in it. I listened to the muffled laughter coming from the study, the sound of glass clinking against glass. I began to peel the skin of the potatoes, falling away in long, curling strips. I worked methodically. I did not mind the work. I minded the lie. But tonight the lie was going to end. I peeled the potato until it was clean and white, stripped of all the dirt, ready for the boiling water. The dining room was a museum of forced tradition. The table was mahogany, long enough to seat 12 but set only for 4. We sat at one end, clustered together like survivors on a raft, though the distance between us felt oceanic. The chandelier overhead cast a fractured crystal light that made the silverware gleam with a hard, predatory brightness. My mother had brought out the spode china, the Christmas set with the holly borders that we were only allowed to touch once a year. It was a production. It was theater. I took my seat on the left side facing the buffet. Caleb sat opposite me, facing the windows, though the night was pitch black and the storm had turned the glass into mirrors. He could only see himself. It was a fitting arrangement. Robert sat at the head, the patriarch presiding over the roast beef that Maria had placed in the center of the table. The meat was rare, bleeding slightly onto the silver platter. The steam rose up, mixing with the scent of the beeswax candles Eleanor insisted on lighting. "Wine, Tiffany?" Robert asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He poured the Cabernet into my glass, filling it too high, a careless gesture. He poured Caleb's with precision, stopping exactly at the widest part of the bowl to let it breathe. "To the gathering," Robert said, raising his glass. It was a generic toast. He drank. We drank. The wine was heavy, tasting of oak and dark fruit. It coated the tongue. We ate in a silence that was not peaceful. It was the silence of people waiting for a signal. All forks scraped against china. The sound was sharp, metallic, and rhythmically irritating. Caleb barely touched his food. He cut a piece of beef, moved it around his plate, and then took another long swallow of wine. He was vibrating. His leg bounced under the table, shaking the floorboards just enough for me to feel it through the soles of my shoes. He looked at his watch again. Then he looked at Robert. Then he looked at Eleanor. He was a performer waiting for the spotlight to hit his mark. I ate methodically. I focused on the mechanics of it. Knife, fork, chew, swallow. I kept my eyes on my plate, but I was watching them. I was always watching them. I saw the way Eleanor looked at Caleb with a hungry anticipation, knowing he had something to give her, a story, a victory, something she could trade for social currency at the club. I saw the way Robert watched him with a mixture of hope and anxiety, desperate for his son to finally be the man he claimed to be. Caleb couldn't wait for dessert. He put his fork down with a clatter. He picked up his knife and tapped the side of his wineglass. Ting, ting, ting. The sound was thin and piercing. "I didn't want to say anything until the ink was dry," Caleb said. His voice was too loud for the room. He was projecting to a boardroom that wasn't there. "But I can't sit on this any longer. It's done. The deal is done." Robert stopped chewing. He lowered his fork. "The deal. Apex logic," Caleb said. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, invading the center space. "We closed the seed round this afternoon. I secured the lead investor. The wire hits the account on the 26th. "Caleb?" Eleanor gasped. She brought her hands to her chest, clutching her pearls. "Who is it? Who did you get?" "A private equity group operating out of a blind trust. Vanguard Holdings. They're serious players, Dad. Heavy hitters. They didn't just fund us, they validated us." Caleb grinned, and it was a wolfish, desperate thing. The valuation came in at $10 million. Post money. He let the number hang in the air. $10 million. Robert sat back in his chair. The tension in his shoulders, a permanent fixture for the last decade of dwindling returns and quiet liquidations, evaporated. He looked 10 years younger. $10 million, he repeated. He rolled the words around his mouth like the scotch. "You built a $10 million company." "On paper," I said. The words slipped out. They were quiet, but they cut through the heat of the moment like a draft from an open window. Caleb's head snapped toward me. His smile didn't vanish, but it hardened. "Excuse me, Tiff." "I said on paper," I repeated, keeping my voice flat. "Valuation is theoretical until a liquidity event. Until then, it's just math." "God, you are a wet blanket," Caleb laughed, shaking his head. He looked at Robert. "She hears 10 million and she worries about the math. This is why you're an accountant, Tiff. You look at the floor. Entrepreneurs look at the horizon." "It's not just the money," Robert said, ignoring me completely. He was looking at his son with a reverence that made my stomach turn. It's the legacy, Caleb. A man builds things. That's what we do. We build. I knew you had it in you. I knew it was just a matter of time before you found the right vehicle. It's a disruptor, Dad. We're using machine learning to optimize supply chain logistics for mid-market retailers. It's scalable. Infinite upside. I took a sip of wine to hide the smirk. Apex Logic was a shell. I knew this because I had read the pitch deck. I had read the pitch deck because I was Vanguard Holdings. Caleb didn't have a proprietary algorithm. He had a WordPress site and a subscription to a ChatGPT API wrapper. He was selling buzzwords to dinosaurs who didn't understand tech. I had created Vanguard Holdings solely to test this theory to see if my brother was a fraud or just incompetent. He was both. But the test had evolved. It wasn't just about competence anymore, it was about character. I'm so proud, Eleanor said. Her eyes were wet. My son, the CEO, the provider. She reached across the table and squeezed Caleb's hand. Then she turned her head, slowly swiveling her neck to look at me. The warmth in her eyes instantly cooled to a frosty disappointment. See, Tiffany? This is what ambition looks like. It's very impressive, I said. Don't be jealous, darling. It's unbecoming, Eleanor said. She picked up her wine glass. Finally, someone in this family has a brain for the big picture. Finally, someone has the guts to take a risk. I take risks, I said. You count other people's money, Robert corrected. He cut into his meat aggressively. There's no shame in it, Tiffany. The world need worker bees. But don't confuse administration with creation. Caleb is a creator. And speaking of money, Eleanor added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I want to make something very clear right now. This is Caleb's success. His. You are not to pester your brother for a loan. I froze. My hand tightened around the stem of the glass. A loan? We know things are tight for you, Eleanor said, gesturing vaguely at my outfit at the concept of me. The car, the apartment in that dreadful part of the city, but Caleb is reinvesting. He can't be supporting you. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, like he has. The irony was so dense I could almost chew it. They were warning me not to beg for money from a man who was at this very moment waiting for my money to hit his account so he could pay off his gambling debts. The investor they were worshipping was the daughter they were dismissing. I don't need a loan, Mother, I said. Good, Caleb said. He poured himself more wine. He was gloating now. The endorphins were flooding his system. Because frankly, Tiff, the burn rate is going to be high. We're scaling fast. I can't have dead weight dragging on the balance sheet. He was using terms he didn't understand. Burn rate, balance sheet. I decided to test the perimeter. I decided to see if he had even read the contract I had sent him, or if he had just signed it blindly in his greed. Who handled the legal for you? I asked. Caleb waved a hand. Some firm the investors use. Standard stuff. Standard stuff, I repeated. So you're comfortable with the terms, specifically the character clause? Caleb paused. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The what? The character clause, I said. I looked him in the eye. It's usually in the representations and warranties, or sometimes attached to the funding triggers. It allows the investor to pull the term sheet in the event of moral turpitude or a material adverse change in the character of the principal. It's a protection against bad faith actors. The table went quiet. Robert looked annoyed. Tiffany, stop trying to sound important. It's Christmas. I'm just asking, I said. It's a seed round. The investors are betting on the jockey, not the horse. If the jockey turns out to be unstable or unethical, they can kill the deal before the wire clears. Did you read Section 4, Paragraph B? Caleb laughed. It was a loud, forced bark of a laugh. He set his glass down hard. God listened to you. Section 4, Paragraph B. This is high finance, Tiff. It's about relationships. It's about trust. These guys love me. We had a Zoom call last week, well, with their rep, and they love the vision. They don't care about the fine print. That's for the lawyers. So you didn't read it, I said. I glanced at it, Caleb snapped. It's boilerplate. Why do you always have to try and pick holes in everything? Are you that miserable? Can't you just be happy that your brother is going to be worth $10 million? I am happy for you, Caleb, I said. I'm just fascinated by the process. It's rare to see a deal of this magnitude close so quickly without due diligence. There was due diligence, Caleb shouted. His face flushed red. They saw the potential. Just because you spend your life auditing people over lunch receipts doesn't mean you understand how venture capital works. It's about speed. It's about capturing the market. Stick to your tax returns, Tiffany. Leave the business to the men. Robert nodded in agreement. She's right, Caleb. Don't let her get under your skin. She doesn't understand the arena. No, I said softly. I suppose I don't. I looked at Caleb. He was smirking now, feeling he had won the exchange. He had put the simple accountant back in her box. He felt powerful. He felt rich. He had no idea that he had just confirmed everything I needed to know. He hadn't read the contract. He believed he was untouchable. He believed his charm had secured the money, not his desperation. He was arrogant. He was careless. And he was cruel. Well, Caleb said, raising his glass again. To the arena. To the arena, Robert echoed. They drank. I did not. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 8:15 p.m. The automated email from my server was scheduled to trigger at 8:30 p.m. provided I didn't cancel it. The command was simple: execute the withdrawal of the offer based on the violation of the specific clause I had just mentioned, the one he had mocked. I had given him a chance. If he had been humble, if he had admitted he was scared, if he had treated me with even a fraction of the respect he gave the waiter at the club, I might have let the money go through. I might have let him have his dream even if it was built on sand. I had the capacity to be a sister. But he had chosen to be a king. And kings who didn't read the treaties they signed were destined to lose their kingdoms. Pass the potatoes, Tiffany, Eleanor said, snapping her fingers. And try to smile. You look like you're at a funeral. I'm sorry, Mother, I said. I passed the bowl. The ceramic was warm in my hands. I was just thinking about the future. Well, stop thinking and start eating, she said. We have a lot to celebrate. I picked up my fork. The metal was cold. Outside, the wind howled against the siding, a low, mournful sound. Inside, the fire crackled, consuming the wood, turning it to ash. I took a bite of the roast beef. It was excellent. It tasted like blood and salt. I chewed slowly, savoring the texture, waiting for the phone to buzz. The main course ended not with satisfaction, but with a restless, narcotic energy. The roast beef lay in ruins on the platter, the juices congealing in the cooler air of the room. The wind outside had picked up, battering the east side of the house, whistling through the gaps in the window frames that my father had promised to seal 5 years ago. Inside, the heat was still oppressive. It pressed against the temples. It made the skin itch. Robert pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harsh and loud against the floorboards. He stood up. He was unsteady, but he held himself with the rigid, practiced posture of a man who refused to admit he was drunk. He picked up the decanter and refilled Caleb's glass, then his own, then Eleanor's. He did not look at my glass. My glass was still half full. I had been nursing the same 2 ounces of Cabernet for 40 minutes. I needed a clear head. I needed the precision of a surgeon. A toast, Robert announced. His voice was thick. To the future of the Pattersons. Eleanor stood immediately, her velvet dress rustling like dry leaves. Caleb stood last, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, tossing it onto the table with a cavalier disregard. He buttoned his suit jacket. It was too tight across the midsection. They stood in a cluster at the head of the table. Robert turned his body toward Caleb. Eleanor turned her body toward Caleb. Caleb turned toward the window, posing for the reflection, then toward our father. They formed a closed triangle. I remained seated. From my position, I was looking at a wall of backs. I saw the fraying seam on the back of my father's collar. I saw the way Eleanor's hair was thinning at the crown, carefully sprayed to hide the scalp. I saw the tension in Caleb's neck, the sweat staining the collar of his shirt. They had physically walled me out. It was not an accident. It was a reflex. In the architecture of this family, I was not a pillar. I was the scaffolding they used to build themselves up and then discarded when the facade was finished. To the future, Eleanor chirped, raising her glass high. And to my son, who has saved us all. To Apex Logic, Robert said. To $10 million. To the return of dignity to this house. To the hustle, Caleb said, clinking his glass against theirs. The sound was bright and exclusive. And to the vision, not everyone has it. Some people just exist. But we build. I watched them drink. The wine looked black in the dim light. I sat very still. My hands were in my lap under the table. My right hand was resting on my phone. The screen was cool against my thumb. Caleb lowered his glass. He turned slightly, looking over his shoulder at me. He didn't turn his body, just his head. It was a dismissive, straining motion. His eyes were glassy and cruel. The alcohol had stripped away the thin veneer of brotherly teasing and left only the rot underneath. And, Caleb added, his voice dropping to a sneer, to leaving the dead weight behind. 2026 is about trimming the fat. No more carrying people who can't carry themselves. He looked right at me. He wanted me to know. He wasn't talking about employees. He wasn't talking about overhead. He was talking about me. The sister who drove a Subaru. The sister who lived in a walk-up. The sister who embarrassed them with her mediocrity. Here, here, Robert muttered, turning his back to me completely again. Oh, stop it, Caleb, you're teasing her. Eleanor giggled, but she didn't look at me. She drank. That was the moment. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. It became very cold and very clear. I did not feel anger. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. It makes your hands shake. It makes you make mistakes. I felt a profound, icy calm. It was the feeling of a ledger finally balancing. It was the feeling of a zero-sum game resolving. I picked up my wine glass with my left hand. I took a sip. I tasted the tannins, the oak, the acidity. I swallowed. With my right hand under the table, I unlocked my phone. I didn't need to look at it. I knew the gesture. Thumbprint, swipe, tap. The email app was already open. The draft was waiting. I had written it 3 hours ago, sitting in my car in a parking lot off I-95. It was addressed to Arthur Penhaligon, my personal attorney, and the face of the blind trust. The subject line was Execute Contingency. The body of the email was short. Material breach of faith. Clause 4B. Character and conduct. Terminate the deal immediately. Inform the principal. I looked at Caleb's back. I looked at the way his suit jacket strained against his shoulders. I thought about the dead weight. I thought about the years of silence, the missed birthdays, the snide remarks about my little job, the way they accepted my checks for groceries or repairs, and never said thank you, only asked why it wasn't more. I pressed send. The data packet left my phone. It traveled through the local cell tower, bounced to a server in Virginia, and landed in Arthur's inbox in London. Arthur was waiting. I paid him $600 an hour to wait. I set my phone down on the table, face down next to my fork. So, Robert said, refilling his glass again. When do we look at houses? Your mother has her eye on a place in Darien, closer to the water. January, Caleb said, expanding his chest. Once the wire hits on the 26th, I'll transfer a bonus to myself. We can start looking immediately. I'm thinking we upgrade the cars first, though. I can't be seen driving the Audi anymore. It's 3 years old. A Porsche, Eleanor suggested. Something fast. Something German, Robert agreed. They were spending the money. They were mentally redecorating their lives with cash that no longer existed. It was fascinating to watch. It was like watching a man walk off a cliff because he believed he could fly. My phone did not make a sound. It was on silent, but Caleb's phone was on the table right next to the gravy boat. It was a large new model face up. 30 seconds passed. The fire popped, spitting a spark against the screen. Bzzzt. The sound was loud against the mahogany, a short, aggressive vibration. Caleb ignored it. Yeah, the Cayenne Turbo. I think that's the move. It's got the presence. Bzzzt. Bzzzt. Two more vibrations. Long ones. An incoming email notification followed by a priority flag. Someone's popular. Eleanor smiled. Probably your investors sending congratulations. Probably, Caleb said. He reached for the phone casually without looking at it, spinning it in his hand. They're needy. They want to make sure I'm happy. That's how it works when you're the prize. He unlocked the phone. I watched his face. I watched the physiology of a crash. At first there was just the dull, drunken glaze of arrogance. He squinted at the screen, trying to focus. Then the squint deepened. His eyebrows drew together. The movement of his thumb stopped. The room was quiet. The wind outside seemed to drop, leaving a vacuum of silence in the dining room. What is it? Robert asked, sensing the shift in static pressure. Good news. Caleb did not answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He blinked. The color, the flush of alcohol and triumph, began to drain from his cheeks. It happened in sections. First his forehead went pale, then his nose, then his jaw. It was like watching a tide go out. He sat down. He didn't pull the chair out. He just collapsed into it, as if his legs had been cut. Caleb! Eleanor stepped forward, her hand reaching out but not touching him. Darling, what's wrong? Caleb looked up. His eyes were wide, dark holes in his face. He looked at Robert. He looked at the wall. He looked at the chandelier. He did not look at me. His voice cracked. It was a dry, rasping sound. They pulled out. Robert frowned, confused. Who pulled out? What are you talking about? Vanguard, Caleb whispered. He looked at the phone again, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something else. I just got an email from their legal counsel. They're terminating the term sheet, effective immediately. That's impossible, Robert barked. He slammed his glass down, spilling wine on the white tablecloth. It spread like a fresh wound. We signed. It's done. You said it was done. It says... Caleb read from the screen, his hand shaking so badly the phone vibrated against his buttons. Pursuant to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Preliminary Agreement, Vanguard Holdings is exercising its right to withdraw all offers of funding due to a reevaluation of the risk profile and character assessment of the principal. This decision is final. Do not contact us. Character assessment, Eleanor shrieked. What does that mean? You're a Patterson. They can't do that, Robert shouted. He grabbed the table edge, his knuckles white. Sue them. Caleb, call your lawyer. Call them right now. We'll sue them for breach of contract. I can't, Caleb said. He sounded like a child. He sounded 5 years old. I don't have a lawyer. I just used the templates they sent. I didn't think... You didn't think... Robert's face turned purple. You told me it was secured. You told me the money was coming. It was, Caleb yelled back, panic rising in his throat. It was a done deal. I don't know what happened. They just killed it. Call them back, Eleanor pleaded. Call the man you spoke to. Explain it's a mistake. Tell them who we are. I can't call them. Caleb threw the phone onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and stopped near the butter dish. It's a blind trust. I don't have a number. I only have an email address for a law firm in London. They're gone, Dad. They're just gone. The silence returned, but now it was heavy. It was the weight of a collapsed roof. The house felt suddenly older, colder. The $10 million had evaporated, and with it the Porsche, the house in Darien, the legacy, the dignity. Caleb put his head in his hands. I spent the deposit, he moaned into his palms. I put 20,000 down on the location. I put 5,000 on the watch. I don't have the cash to cover the checks. Robert stared at his son. The look of adoration was gone. It was replaced by a look of absolute terrifying clarity. He saw the fraud. He saw the failure. I picked up my fork. I speared a small roasted potato. I brought it to my mouth. I ate it. It was cold, but the texture was firm. I wiped my mouth with my napkin. It sounds like a due diligence issue, I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through their panic like a razor blade. They all turned to look at me. For the first time all night, I was not invisible. I was the only thing in the room that was solid. "What did you say?" Caleb hissed, lifting his head. His eyes were red. I repeated, reaching for the wine bottle and pouring the last of the Cabernet into my glass. It sounds like the investor realized the asset wasn't worth the risk. It happens. I swirled the wine. I looked at the liquid, deep and red and opaque. I felt the vibration of the secret in my chest, a warm, burning coal of truth. They were terrified. They were ruined. And they still didn't know the half of it. "You have some bad news, Caleb," I said, taking a sip. "The investor just pulled out. And you're right. They aren't going to call you back." I smiled. It was a small smile. It didn't reach my eyes. It was the smile of a banker closing a foreclosure. "How do you know?" Caleb whispered. I set the glass down. "Because I know exactly what Section 4, Paragraph B says." The room did not explode. Real disasters rarely happen with a bang. They happen with a slow, suffocating slide into silence. The wind outside had died down, leaving the house wrapped in a heavy, muffled stillness. The only sound was Caleb's breathing, which was wet and shallow, the sound of a lung trying to find oxygen in a vacuum. "How do I know what?" Caleb asked. His voice was no longer the boom of a CEO. It was the thin scratch of a cornered animal. "How do you know about Paragraph B?" "Because I wrote it," I said. I set my fork down. It made a sharp clack against the spode china. The sound was disproportionately loud. Robert stared at me. His face was a map of confusion and rising irritation. He looked at me as if I had started speaking a foreign language. "Don't be ridiculous, Tiffany. This isn't a game. Your brother is in crisis. Stop making up stories to get attention." "It's not a story, Dad," I said. "It's a transaction." "You wrote it." Caleb laughed. It was a jagged, hysterical sound. "You wrote the term sheet for Vanguard Holdings. You file tax returns for plumbers in Stamford Tiff. You drive a Subaru with rust on the fender. Do you have any idea how insane you sound right now?" "I do," I said. "I sound like the person who just canceled your funding." "Stop it!" Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. Her bracelets jangled a jarring, discordant noise. "This is cruel, Tiffany. Even for you, Caleb is losing everything and you're sitting there making up lies. You should be ashamed. Apologize to your brother, right now." "I don't think I will," I said. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, ruining the perfect gel style. He stood up, knocking his chair back. He paced the small length of the rug. "I have to fix this. I have to fix this. Dad, the checks, the down payments. I wrote a check for the office lease today, post-dated for the 27th. If that bounces—" He stopped. He looked at Robert with wide, terrified eyes. "It's fraud. If I signed the lease knowing I didn't have the funds, that's fraud." "We'll cover it," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was doing mental math, and I could see the sums coming up short. "We'll pull from the retirement accounts. We'll take a bridge loan." "You don't have the liquidity, Robert," I said calmly. "You're leveraged on the house. You took a second mortgage in 2021 to cover the club dues and the roof repairs you never actually did. I saw the filing at the county clerk's office." Robert turned to me. The veins in his neck bulged. "You went through my records." "Public records," I corrected. "I'm an accountant. I notice things, like how you're cash poor and asset heavy in a market that's softening." You little bitch, Caleb spat. He stepped toward me. You're enjoying this. You're sitting there drinking your wine and enjoying this. You think it's funny that I'm ruined. I don't think it's funny, I said. I think it's a correction. The market corrects itself when the valuation doesn't match the asset. I am not an asset, Caleb screamed. I am your brother. Are you? I asked, because 10 minutes ago I was dead weight. 10 minutes ago I was the person you were going to leave behind in 2026. You toasted to it. Caleb stopped. He blinked. The memory of his own cruelty seemed to hit him, but he dismissed it instantly. That was business talk. It wasn't personal. It's all personal, I said. That's what you missed. Vanguard Holdings isn't a faceless firm in London. It's a shell company. Delaware registration, managed by a blind trust. I am the sole beneficiary. Bullshit, Caleb said. Bullshit. You don't have that kind of money. You never have. I have been a forensic accountant for 7 years, I said. I specialize in quietest lawsuits and asset recovery. 3 years ago, I helped the Department of Justice recover $40 million in cryptocurrency from a Ponzi scheme operating out of a server farm in New Jersey. My whistleblower fee was 15%. I watched the numbers land. 15% of $40 million, $6 million, plus the market gains since then. No, Eleanor whispered. She looked at my coat hanging in the hall. She looked at my boots. No, you shop at Target. I like Target, I said. And I like having $6 million in the bank more than I like wearing it on my wrist. Liar, Robert said. He stood up, leaning over the table, his face inches from mine. He smelled of scotch and fear. You are a liar. You've always been a liar. You're trying to hurt him because you're jealous. If you had money, you wouldn't live the way you live. No one does that. Smart people do that, I said. Prove it, Caleb said. His voice was shaking. If you're Vanguard, prove it. Show me the wire authorization. Show me the email chain. Happily, I picked up my phone. I tapped the screen. The brightness was turned up. I navigated to the secure banking app. I opened the pending transactions tab. There it was. A scheduled wire transfer for $1 million, the first tranche of the seed funding. Status canceled by user. I held the phone out. I didn't hand it to him. I held it in the center of the table like a lantern. Caleb leaned in. Robert leaned in. Eleanor put on her reading glasses. They looked at the screen. They saw the logo of the private bank. They saw the account name Vanguard Holdings LLC or T. Patterson Trust. They saw the amount, $1,000. And they saw the red block letters, canceled. Caleb made a sound like he had been punched in the stomach. He slumped back against the sideboard. It's you, he whispered. You were the investor. I was the silent partner, I said. I wanted to help you. I knew you couldn't get funding from a traditional VC because your product is vaporware. But I thought maybe if he has the capital, he can hire engineers who actually know what they're doing. Maybe he can grow into the suit. I withdrew the phone and placed it back on the table screen down. I set up the trust so you wouldn't know it was me, I continued. Because I knew if you knew, you wouldn't treat it like an investment. You'd treat it like a handout. You'd treat it like you treat me. You let me believe. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. You let me believe I was a genius. You let me spend the money. I let you take a test, I said. The term sheet had conditions. Due diligence isn't just about the product, Caleb. It's about the CEO. I wanted to see how you behaved when you thought you had won. I wanted to see if success made you generous or if it made you a monster. I'm not a monster, Caleb sobbed. I'm under a lot of pressure. You literally turned your back on me, I said. I pointed to the chairs. Tonight, at this table, you toasted to cutting me off. You toasted to my irrelevance. You looked me in the eye and called me dead weight. I was drunk, Caleb pleaded. He looked at our parents. Mom, tell her I was just blowing off steam. Eleanor looked at me. Her face had changed. The shock was gone, replaced by a terrifying, calculating sharpness. She was looking at me not as her daughter, but as a newfound resource. The realization of my net worth was rewriting her entire understanding of who I was. Tiffany, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a soothing, honeyed register. Darling, let's all take a breath. Caleb made a mistake. He was rude. We admit that. But surely you didn't mean to actually cancel the funding. You were teaching him a lesson, right? A very effective lesson. It's cancelled, Mother, I said. But you can uncancel it, Robert said. He moved around the table, approaching me. He put a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy and fake. Tiffany, look at what you've achieved. We're astonished. Really. To hide your success like that, it shows incredible discipline, just like your old man. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Don't touch me. Robert pulled his hand back as if burned. Now listen, we're a family. Families help each other. Caleb is your brother. He's in a hole, a deep hole. If he defaults on these contracts, it's bankruptcy. It's humiliation. You can't let that happen. Not when you can fix it with a push of a button. I can fix it, I agreed. But I won't. Why? Caleb cried out. Why are you doing this to me? Because you aren't a good investment, I said. I spoke clearly, enunciating every consonant. I don't invest in bad risks. And you, Caleb, are a bad risk. You are arrogant, you are lazy, and you are mean. You treat people you think are beneath you like dirt, and tonight you thought I was beneath you. I'm sorry. Caleb dropped to his knees. It was pathetic. It was a performance. I'm sorry, Tiff. I take it back. I'll make you a partner. We'll split the equity. 50-50. Just put the money back. The money is gone, I said. I moved it to a different asset class 5 minutes ago. The liquidity is gone. You're lying, Robert snarled. The nice act vanished. You're doing this out of spite. You're a vindictive, miserable little girl who can't stand to see her brother shine. He wasn't shining, Dad, I said. He was reflecting. He was reflecting my money. And now the light is off. I stood up. The movement was sudden. They flinched. I tried, I said. I really did. I came here tonight hoping you would prove me wrong. I kept the kill switch open until the very last second. I waited for one kind word, one question about my life. One moment where you didn't treat me like a servant in my own childhood home. I looked at the three of them. Caleb on his knees, weeping into the rug. Eleanor clutching her pearls, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. Robert purple with impotent rage. But you couldn't do it, I said. You couldn't even pretend. You can't leave, Eleanor said. Her voice was shrill. You can't just drop a bomb like this and leave. It's Christmas. Merry Christmas, I said. I picked up my purse. I checked my phone one last time. The confirmation email from the bank had arrived. The transfer was voided. The capital was safe. Tiffany. Caleb grabbed the hem of my coat. Please, I'll lose the apartment. I'll lose the car. Then lose them, I said. I pulled my coat free from his grip. Sell the watch, Caleb. It should cover your rent for a month. If you can find a buyer. I walked toward the foyer. The sound of my boots on the hardwood was the only rhythm in the house. If you walk out that door, Robert shouted after me, don't you dare come back. You hear me? If you destroy this family, you are dead to us. I stopped at the doorway. I turned around. The hallway was long and shadowed. They looked like ghosts at the end of a tunnel. I didn't destroy this family, Robert, I said. I just audited it. I opened the heavy oak door. The cold air rushed in, clean and sharp and purifying. It swirled around me, blowing away the scent of the roast beef and the stale perfume. I stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped, but the ground was covered in white. It was a blank slate. I didn't look back. I closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a sound of finality that felt better than any check I had ever cashed. I stood on the porch for a moment, the cold air biting into the exposed skin of my neck. The silence of the winter night was heavy, pressing against the house like a physical weight. I reached into my pocket for my car keys. My hand met only the rough wool of the lining and the smooth glass of my phone. The keys were not there. I patted the other pocket. Empty. I closed my eyes and let out a breath that plumed white in the darkness. I saw them in my mind's eye, the keychain with the small brass Subaru logo resting on the white tablecloth next to the untouched gravy boat. I had placed them there when I sat down, a reflex of habit. I had to go back in. The narrative demanded it. I turned the brass handle. The door was heavy. I pushed it open and stepped back into the foyer. The heat hit me again, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. It felt stale. It felt like the air in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. They were still there. The tableau had barely shifted, but the energy had inverted. "She's back," Robert said. He was standing near the archway of the dining room. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved, but it was a desperate, sweaty kind of relief. "I told you she'd come back. She's a Patterson. We don't run from a fight." I walked past him without speaking. I walked into the dining room. The candles had burned down, the wax pooling on the silver holders. The roast beef was cold. "Tiffany," Eleanor said. She was standing by the sideboard. She had reapplied her lipstick. It was a shade too bright for the ruins of the evening. She smoothed her dress and took a step toward me. Her face had undergone a transformation. The sneer of the critic was gone, replaced by a smile that was terrifying in its artificiality. It was a smile constructed of pure calculation. She looked at me, and she did not see her daughter. She saw a balance sheet. She saw liquidity. She saw a lifeline. "Tiffany, darling," she said, her voice dropping into a register I hadn't heard since I was a child, a tone she usually reserved for the wives of bank presidents. "I'm so glad you came back inside. It's too cold to leave on such a unresolved note." "I forgot my keys," I said. "Of course you did," she said, stepping closer. She reached out and touched my arm. Her fingers were cold. "It's a sign. We need to talk. We need to reset." I looked at her hand on my coat. I looked at her eyes. There was no warmth there, only utility. I was suddenly valuable. I had utility. I was the new lead investor, and she was already beginning the pitch. "We were shocked," Eleanor continued, her words tumbling out fast. "That's all it was. Shock. You have to understand, you've been so quiet about your life. We had no idea you were operating at this level. It's impressive, truly. Robert was just saying it's the most Patterson thing anyone has done in years." "Is it?" I asked. "Absolutely," Robert said, coming up behind her. He poured himself another scotch, his hand shaking slightly less now. "Stealth, strategy, holding your cards close. It's exactly what I would have done. You have the killer instinct, Tiffany. I underestimated that. I admit it." He raised his glass to me. It was a peace offering. It was a bribe. "We can discuss the terms," Eleanor said, tightening her grip on my arm. "The character clause. It's harsh, yes, but it's negotiable. We're family. We can work out a structure. A loan, perhaps. Or an equity stake. Caleb would be willing to give you a seat on the board. Wouldn't you, Caleb?" We all looked at Caleb. He was still sitting at the table. He had not moved. His head was in his hands, his fingers tangled in his hair. He looked small. The bespoke suit looked like a costume he had rented and couldn't figure out how to take off. "Caleb," Eleanor prompted, her voice sharpening. Caleb looked up. His face was blotchy. His eyes were red. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a glimmer of humility. I thought I saw the brother I used to play with in the snow before he learned that kindness was a weakness. "Yeah," Caleb whispered. "Yeah, anything. Just don't let me drown, Tiff. Please. I can't go back to the guys at the club and tell them I failed. I can't." He didn't care about the product. He didn't care about the work. He cared about the club. He cared about the audience. "You see," Eleanor beamed, "he's reasonable. We're all reasonable people here. We can sit down, have some dessert. Maria made that tart you like. We can figure out the numbers. She tried to pull me toward the chair I had been exiled to the chair that was now the head of the table. I pulled my arm away. The movement was gentle but firm. I walked to the table. I picked up my keys. The metal was cold against my palm. The house felt incredibly small. The ceilings, which had always seemed so high, now looked low and stained with smoke. The furniture looked old. The parents looked like actors who had forgotten their lines and were improvising badly. They were shrunken by their own greed. They were not giants. They were just people who owed too much money and had too little soul. I'm not staying for dessert, I said. Tiffany, don't be stubborn. Robert snapped, the mask slipping for a second. This is business. You don't walk away from a deal when the counterparty is willing to concede. There is no deal, I said. The deal is dead. I looked at Caleb one last time. He was staring at the empty space where his future used to be. I took the linen napkin from my place setting. It was white crisp and folded into a perfect triangle. I placed it gently on the table right next to his hand. It looked like a surrender flag. Pay for your own dinner, Caleb, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bridge collapsing. I turned around and walked to the foyer. I did not rush. I buttoned my coat. I put my gloves on, adjusting the fingers until they were snug. If you walk out that door, Eleanor's voice rang out shrill and cracking. You are choosing to be alone. Do you hear me? You'll have your money, but you won't have us. I opened the door. The wind swirled in, carrying dry snow. I know, I said. I stepped out and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The latch clicked, a solid mechanical sound that severed the connection. I walked to the Subaru. The snow crunched under my boots, a clean, honest sound. I unlocked the car and got in. The air inside was freezing. I turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and then caught with a steady, reliable hum. I turned on the headlights. The beams cut through the dark, illuminating the falling snow. I did not look at the house. I shifted into reverse and backed out of the space. I drove down the long, winding driveway, the gravel popping under the tires. I reached the main road and turned right toward the highway, toward the city. I turned on the heater. The fan rattled, then blew warm air against my hands. I was alone in the dark, driving through a blizzard. But for the first time in my life, I did not feel cold. I felt the weight of the check I hadn't written sitting safely in the cloud, unspent and uncompromised. I felt the vibration of the engine. I felt the road. I drove. The snow kept falling, covering my tracks, erasing the path back, leaving only the way forward. As the red taillights of the Subaru vanished into the curtain of white, the long silence of the Patterson estate finally felt complete. Tiffany had balanced the scales, proving that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. If you enjoyed this journey of quiet resilience, please subscribe and share your reactions below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.